Welcome to Talk World Radio, a half-hour discussion of politics as if the people mattered. I'm David Swanson. This week on Talk World Radio, we are talking about Palestine and the whole region of Western Asia. We are very privileged to have with us as a guest Mouin Rabbani, who is a Middle East analyst specializing in the Arab-Israeli conflict and Palestinian affairs. He is the co-editor of the book Aborted State, the UN Initiative and New Palestinian Junctures. He has written for numerous publications and regularly posts writings and videos on Substack. Mouin Rabbani, welcome to Talk World Radio.
Thank you, and it's great to be on your program.
Thanks for being here. I'll just say to those watching video, yes, I have a broken wrist for being an idiot and trying to walk on 5 inches of solid ice, which coats everything here in Virginia and has for a week or more. And I'm waiting for a doctor because the US healthcare system sucks. But imagine if I were in Gaza, where they're killing the doctors and they've killed the rest of my family. It just, I can't imagine. It's horror. Mouin Rabbani, you've written a lot about what's been done to Gaza over the years, the decades, and recent months. One topic is the casualties, which we've had wildly varying reports on. What can you tell us is the extent of the killing and destruction?
Well, the official casualty count is over 71,000. That is data collected by the Gaza Ministry of Health, which in previous Israeli onslaughts on the Gaza Strip has consistently been found to produce reliable data, data which is collected professionally. As you and your viewers may be aware, during the past 2 years, there has been a systematic campaign to discredit the Gaza Ministry of Health, not only by Israel, but by its apologists, kind of a network of self-proclaimed scholars who claim to investigate this data and find all kinds of massive errors and deliberate fraud in its work. And of course, you also had prominent media organizations like the BBC who would always highlight suspicions and skepticism about the Gaza Ministry of Health. They would always refer to it as the Hamas-run Ministry of Health, for example, seeking to undermine its credibility, while, for example, never repeating, the Israeli military's record of systematic prevarication and forgery and fraud. And then this week, we read in the Israeli press, in several newspapers, I should add, that the Israeli military has publicly confirmed the accuracy, the reliability, the credibility of the data produced by the Hamas-run Gaza Ministry of Health.
Okay, wait, there's something ludicrous about the Israeli military confirming something. I mean, how can known, habitual, practiced, open liars confirm something? And what about those who say, when you look at deaths and injuries in wars, the identified, named individuals, you have to multiply by 5 or 10 to get a real number?
Let me try to answer that. I mean, the military will have had its own motives for suddenly coming out and claiming or confirming the credibility of these figures, and I'm happy to get into that in a second. But to me, the most interesting part is that the Israeli military has left all its apologists out to dry. All these people who have been doing its bidding now for 2 years have they did this amazing pirouette as soon as the report came out, saying, actually, there's no news here. We've been saying this all along. We never doubted the casualty figures. We were just taking issue with the Gaza Ministry of Health's classification of civilians versus combatants. Well, two problems with that, and there have been numerous posts on social media confirming this. First of all these people claiming they've never doubted the ministry or its figures are having all their posts revived and posted showing that that's exactly what they were doing. Secondly, they couldn't have taken issue with the Gaza Ministry of Health's breakdown of civilian versus combatant casualties because the ministry never makes that distinction. It only gives names, ages, gender, identity numbers, confirmed people. Now, yes, it is an undercount because the ministry's professional standards require verification of the death. So the thousands of corpses that remain buried under the 61 million tons of rubble in the Gaza Strip are not counted. More importantly, those who were killed, it counts only those who were killed as a direct result of Israeli military activity, meaning bombings, shootings, and so on. Those who have died as a result of hunger, as a result of exposure, as a result of Israel's prohibition on the entry of medical supplies, and so on, are not counted. So the strengths of the healthcare system in the Gaza Strip means that there are probably significantly fewer indirect deaths, as they're known, than in perhaps many other conflicts in that part of the world. But those may well be on the cusp of rising dramatically because vaccination programs have essentially ended. People have very weakened immune systems. Disease is becoming increasingly widespread as a result of conditions imposed by Israel and so on.
There's always a new twist. There's always some additional horror every week with this war slash genocide. And one of those indirect ways of killing people through violence, maybe bulldozing relief organizations,
Yes.
which seems to be a new approach. I guess, those who die as a result of that won't be counted either, but they'll still die, right? What's
Yes. I
going
mean,
on?
Israel has for decades been launching a campaign against an organization known as the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees. It's the largest United Nations agency, at least the one with the largest number of employees, and it provides services and assistance to Palestinian refugees, not only in the occupied territories, but also in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And of course, Israel's flunkies in the US Congress, of whom there are very, very, very many, have been doing its bidding for decades as well, launching a frontal assault on this organization. The real issue here, it's not a campaign against UNRWA so much as it's a campaign against the very existence of the Palestinian refugee question and seeking to liquidate it. And UNRWA happens to be the most visible surrogate for what is essentially a political campaign. And what we've had in the past few years is the United States, which used to be one of the largest funders of this agency, has ended its funding, has called for it to be abolished. Israel has actually designated UNRWA as a terrorist organization on the basis of accusations it has made against the organization that independent investigations have shown to be thoroughly unfounded, as the International Court of Justice just a few months ago stated were unsubstantiated. And most recently, Israel systematically demolished, with bulldozers and the rest of it, the headquarters of UNRWA in Jerusalem and then set it on fire. I mean, pure vandalism conducted with international support and acquiescence. More importantly, just if I to get to your point, the International Court of Justice, in its recent advisory opinion, pointed out that no organization has the expertise and experience to deliver humanitarian services to the Palestinian population, as does UNRWA, and that Israel is under a positive obligation not only to not prevent it from working, but to assist its operations. And it has, of course, been doing the exact opposite.
And while it's doing that and keeping food and supplies out, there is this supposed ceasefire. Every day, the ceasefire is challenged. There's an exception to the ceasefire. There's people killed despite the ceasefire. Has there ever been a ceasefire like this before, where nobody ceased firing? Is this more Orwellian than usual? What's
Yes, I mean
happening?
it's an Israeli ceasefire, which means you cease and I fire. The agreement was reached on October 8th. Both Israel and the Palestinians accepted a number of commitments under that agreement. The U.S. Intelligence is reported to have said that they were taken aback by the extent to which the Palestinians, against their doubts, are actually scrupulously fulfilling their commitments under that October 8th agreement. Well, Israel, and now I'm speaking rather than citing U.S. intelligence, has systematically violated each and every one of its commitments under that agreement. It concerned exchange of captives, in which Israel did not release either the numbers or the categories it agreed to. It committed to withdrawing to a certain line within the Gaza Strip, which it has been expanding on an almost daily basis since that time. It committed to specific targets for the entry of humanitarian goods and supplies, aid, into the Gaza Strip, and has obstructed that systematically. And most importantly, it has killed, I believe by now, over 500 Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians, in daily bombings and air raids and shootings since October 8th. So makes a mockery of the very definition of a ceasefire. These are not people being killed in combat or crossfire, I should add.
And it's not even Mouin Rabbani. It's not even just called a ceasefire. It's called peace by the President of the United States, who has now created, I'm not sure what its status is or what's legal about it, but a thing called a peace board run by famous war criminals to oversee. I mean, people objected when Trump claimed to have made a deal about Greenland without talking to anyone in Greenland, right? But this seems to be a government of Palestine, or at least Gaza, without consulting a single Palestinian. What is this
Yes.
thing? What does it have to do with peace?
Well, when Trump unveiled his initiative in a White House press conference together with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the 29th of September of last year, in the course of that press conference, he said that, the U.S. would also be forming what he called a board of peace, and he would serve as its CEO. And people kind of laughed this off as just another Trump vanity project, the narcissist in chief, preparing to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, having just gotten the inaugural FIFA Peace Prize, was now establishing this outfit and, needless to say, putting himself at the head of it. Then, shortly thereafter, the U.S. managed to successfully ram a resolution through the United Nations Security Council that made absolutely no reference to the existing corpus of resolutions and international law concerning the question of Palestine, but it did confirm the Board of Peace without even having seen its charter or its modes of operations or whatever. And last month, at the annual Davos gathering of the rich and objectionable, Trump unveiled this Board of Peace, which basically is intended to make him CEO of not only the United States, but of the planet. He is president for life. every single decision is subject to his discretion and approval. He can get rid of people he doesn't want. The Gaza Strip is essentially coming under colonial domination with the change that, you go back to the 19th century and the various European powers would often be in conflict or rivalry about, who would get this piece of land in Asia or Africa or wherever. Now there isn't that rivalry. There's kind of an agreement that it will be a colony administered internationally rather than just by one country, with the US, of course, being in charge. But as you mentioned, no Palestinian was consulted on this. More importantly, the fugitive from international justice, Benjamin Netanyahu, is actually a member of the Board of Peace. What more do you need to know about this than that?
It strikes me as sort of gentrification on steroids. You see
Yes,
that
that's well
neighborhood in a
put.
US
Hmm.
city that looks nicer. Oh, how wonderful they made this neighborhood look nicer. And you find out that the people who had lived there for generations have been priced out and driven out, and some of them are living on the street because they can't find anywhere they can afford to live. We see these pictures of these shining skyscrapers on the beach in Gaza, and even the buildings are all white, of course. And you have to ask, where are they going to put all the people who lived there? What happens to them?
Well, it is being ridiculed and criticized for that matter as an initiative that completely ignores the political crisis that led to the situation that we're discussing today, that completely elides Palestinian rights and the internationally recognized inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, and um, instead converts the Gaza Strip into a real estate project and a money making. Genocide is good money as well. But having said that, don't be distracted by the shiny images, because if you look closely at, for example, what Prince Jared of Kushner presented in Davos, it's actually a frighteningly dystopian proposal where Palestinians will be herded into these very controlled environments where they will be digitally monitored 24/7 with, biometric identity cards, cashless economies, so that every single transaction they take can be monitored, where they will be vetted every time they put one foot in front of the other. And it's basically it's a joint venture, if you will, between the main technology companies, private capital, and the state. And it's exceptionally frightening, assuming that it is implementable, which I wouldn't exclude, but about which I have very serious doubts.
It seems to me that the horrors in Gaza are ongoing, that they've never ceased, but
Exactly.
that the Trump world chaos, the threats of six new wars a week, and the warlike ICE occupations of U.S. cities that fascinate U.S. media consumers vastly more than wars that are in other parts of the world, have taken the spotlight off. Are you concerned that people are paying less attention?
Well, I do think people are paying less attention. On the one hand, major Israeli military operations in the Gaza Strip have been replaced by a much lower intensity of military operations, while the genocide is now continuing primarily through, preventing adequate shelter materials entering at the height of winter, severely restricting food and medical supplies, and so on. So you have people dying, for example, infants and the elderly dying of exposure of communicable diseases and so on. So on the one hand, that has taken, for many people, taken the focus away, and they perhaps even think this is a crisis that has come to an end. On the other hand, of course, you have newly emerging crises. You mentioned Greenland, Venezuela, now Iran. And, that is how the news cycle works. But having said that, I do still think that there are masses of very dedicated and committed people throughout the world who, on a daily basis, are doing what they can to make sure that this issue does not become dead and buried. And primarily because, from their perspective, and quite rightly so, that even if you assume that everything has ended, there is still an exceptionally important issue, that the file that has not yet been opened, accountability.
Not Epstein. Accountability. Lots of
That's
files
right.
that haven't been opened.
Yeah, yeah, well put. Yeah.
Mouin Rabbani, the other thing we're seeing with ICE all over the news in the United States is some of these wars coming back. A guy who learns to kill people in Iraq and is thanked for the service shoots a woman in the face in Minneapolis. These troops, have been brought up and trained in these wars and trained by the Israelis and by the US military to do a military occupation. I mean, if there's a war on Iran, if there's a war on Venezuela, do you think anybody can start to make the connection, can understand that what they got upset about in Minnesota, they should also get upset about in Gaza and in Tehran and in Caracas?
I think you're beginning to see increasing signs of that. I mean, if you recall, the aftermath of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and as the US began to draw down its forces, it had huge amounts of surplus military material that it began donating, I think, or selling perhaps, to US police forces throughout the country. And this in turn led to an exponential militarization of policing across U.S. towns and cities. Um, and you would see kind of activists or academics writing about these things, but it didn't really seem to penetrate very deeply in the public consciousness. You did begin to see a bit of that with Black Lives Matter and its precursors, like in Ferguson and so on. But I think now, with these summary executions in Minneapolis, and people being much more conscious about what is happening abroad, because, Gaza was a live stream genocide, and people have taken more interest in how their own authorities cooperate with Israel. I think people are becoming much more conscious of that, and you're hearing a lot more commentary about it as well.
Do, what do you think is going to come next? Because it looks like there's about to be a war on Iran. We've seen this threatened for decades. We've seen the same set of lies pushed for decades, the nuclear thing, and there's not the resistance. You have Europeans claiming they're standing up to Trump over Greenland, but they're gonna, have U.S. bases all over Europe used for an attack on Iran. It's not really impressive standing up job. What? And of course, the U.S. Congress is flat on its back. So, what's going to happen here?
Well, a relative of mine who lives in the Gulf earlier today reached out and asked me the same question, and I'll tell you what I told him, which is that the bad news is that I think a U.S. or joint U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran is both inevitable and most likely imminent as well. The good news is that I've been wrong before, and I'm sure to be wrong again. So we'll have to see what happens. But I do think that all the indications point to an attack. Now, many very competent analysts will explain to you why the U.S. is not in a position to successfully attack Iran, because if it does a symbolic attack or limits its offensive to air power, it won't be able to change anything on the ground. And if it wants to change anything in the ground, it will have to commit resources and manpower and so on beyond what the White House is willing to accept. And while that's true, the rational is not always what happens, especially when you have essentially an empty vessel in the White House who's characterized by a vacuum between his ears. And what you really have now is a contest between, let's say, the hawks, the Israel flunkies, the neocons, who are agitating for an attack on Iran yesterday, versus the non-interventionists who are seeking to hold Trump back. And usually in such circumstances, I think it's the hawks who emerge victorious, particularly given that in the aftermath of Venezuela and so on, Trump has probably been persuaded, that one and done, that U.S. military power can shock and awe anyone into submission, that he doesn't have to worry about a prolonged engagement. But as people have been saying for years, a significant military attack on Iran will most likely make Iraq look like child's play.
Mouin Rabbani, we have just a couple of minutes left. I'm afraid that if Trump or the people advising him think they can do a limited war on Iran, but Iran responds by attacking any of 7 or 8 countries on its border that have U.S. bases, plus the ships in the water. The U.S. will respond to Iran's response, and there's no controlling that. There's no ability to say here's going to be the limits of this war. I don't think.
No, and if you look at it from Iran's perspective, its previous policy of what it called strategic patience has proven to be a complete failure because it didn't prevent it from a war being waged against it this June. Um, its comparative restraint in June appears to have only whetted the Israeli and U.S. appetite, even for even further concessions and capitulation, while the Europeans are busy beating the drums of war as well. And what appears to be the case is that the Iranians have made a decision that if there's going to be another conflict, they need to hit much harder to warn off the Americans and the Israelis. Now, if that is indeed the case, and imagine that they have even a mildly successful missile attack on a U.S. destroyer or aircraft carrier and cause a number of U.S. casualties, or manage to once again successfully penetrate strategic sites in Israel, or even, manage to obstruct the Straits of Hormuz and energy prices start going through the roof. Then you have a situation where it will be very difficult for the Americans to, cut and run and declare victory and go home, as Trump did in June. And therefore, I think on this occasion, you're not going to be able to have a limited conflict the way that we did previously.
Well, on that cheerful note, I am glad we have the ability to talk about these things honestly, and I hope some people are listening. We've been speaking with Mouin Rabbani, who is a Middle East analyst, specializes in the Arab-Israeli conflict and Palestinian affairs. We will have links up to his Substack and his other writings at talkworldradio.org. Mouin Rabbani, thank you very, very much for coming on Talk World Radio.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
This is Talk World Radio. I'm David Swanson. Take action at rootsaction.org. Help end war at worldbeyondwar.org. Read or listen to today's Peace Almanac entry at peacealmanac.org. All past shows can be heard at talkworldradio.org. Talk World Radio is produced in Charlottesville, Virginia, and syndicated by Pacifica Network. There is no way to peace. Peace is the way.